The motto, by most accounts, started as something close to a joke, a rhyme stitched onto a shoulder patch for men whose actual assignment, on paper, was construction rather than combat. We build, we fight. It scanned nicely, it looked good stitched in thread, and in the earliest days of the unit that wore it, more than one man probably said it with a wry half-smile, aware that the fighting part was mostly theoretical for tradesmen who had been recruited to pour concrete and grade roads. The war did not let it stay theoretical for long. Hold one number as we go, and it is not a weight or a caliber this time. 18, roughly the number of years separating the average age of the tradesmen in these units from the 18-year-old riflemen who often fought beside them. By the end of this hour, that number will explain something about who these men actually were that no statistic about tonnage of coral moved ever could. Sit for a moment with the earlier, unmilitarized version of this work, because understanding what came before the militarization makes clear exactly what problem it solved. Before the war, and in its earliest opening months, much of the overseas construction work the Navy needed had been carried out by civilian contract laborers, skilled men doing skilled work, but doing it as civilians, unarmed, with no combatant status under the laws of war, sent to build airfields and facilities in places that were, or were rapidly becoming, active war zones. When several of these civilian construction sites came under direct enemy attack in the war's opening months, the men caught there had no legal standing to defend themselves as combatants, and no formal military organization to fall back on if capture, or worse, followed. This channel will not dramatize any single one of those incidents with invented specifics it cannot verify. But the pattern itself, well enough documented to be treated as solid ground, is precisely what forced the Navy's hand. The old civilian contractor model had been overtaken by the reality of the war these men were being sent into, and something new had to replace it, fast. Name the formation plainly, because a vague gesture at these units undersells how deliberate and rapid the institutional decision behind them actually was. The first of these battalions were organized in the opening weeks of 1942 in direct response to a problem international law had made unavoidable: civilian contractors, who had been doing much of the Navy's overseas construction work before the war, had no legal standing to bear arms or resist capture as combatants if the position they were building came under attack. And several documented incidents of civilian construction workers captured or killed in the war's opening months made the gap in that arrangement brutally clear. The solution was to militarize the trade itself, recruit the same kind of skilled tradesmen who had been doing this work as civilians, but enlist them as uniformed Navy personnel with the legal standing, the training, and the weapons to defend the ground they were building if it came to that. The units took their popular nickname from the initials of their official designation, a name that stuck immediately and outlasted the formal title in nearly every account written about them since. This is the fourth and closing episode of a short run this channel has spent deliberately on the ordinary soldier rather than the famous machine. A light tank dismissed as a toy in one war and proven in another. A 13-pound tube that let a single rifleman do a gun crew's job. And now, the man who built the ground every other story on this channel has quietly depended on without ever stopping to name them. There is a reason this run closes here rather than anywhere else. Every airfield a bomber took off from, every road a tank column advanced down, every dock a Higgins boat unloaded onto, existed because someone built it first, usually under worse conditions and with less recognition than almost anyone this channel has covered in 3 years of records. This episode is this channel's attempt to name that debt plainly, once before the season turns back to machines for its final stretch. Start with the decision that made this whole story possible, because it was a genuinely unusual one, and understanding it explains everything that followed. Rather than draw personnel for these new construction units from the ordinary pool of young recruits and train them in a trade from scratch, the Navy went looking specifically for men who already had one. Carpenters, electricians, heavy equipment operators, welders. Men in their 30s and 40s who had spent a working lifetime learning skills no boot camp could teach in a few weeks. This was not a sentimental gesture toward experienced tradesmen. It was a hard-nosed recognition that the problem the war was about to present, building serviceable military infrastructure fast, in terrible conditions, far from any established supply chain, was a problem experienced builders would solve considerably faster and more reliably than eager young men with no trade behind them at all. The institution, for once, correctly diagnosed what a genuine emergency actually required and recruited for exactly that, rather than for youth and enthusiasm alone. Consider too the age and experience these tradesmen brought that ordinary wartime recruitment almost never captured, because it is worth dwelling on before the story moves further into the campaigns themselves. A 20-year-old machine gunner learns his trade almost entirely inside the war itself, trained in weeks, tested for the first time under fire alongside men his own age, who are learning the same lessons at the same pace he is. A 40-year-old master carpenter or heavy equipment operator recruited into one of these units arrived already carrying 2 decades of accumulated judgment about how materials behave, how machinery fails, how to solve a problem with whatever happens to be at hand rather than what the manual says should be there. Judgment that no amount of wartime urgency could compress into a younger man in the same short span of training. The Navy's recruitment strategy was, in effect, a bet that decades of civilian trade experience would translate directly onto a battlefield in a way few other wartime skills could. And the record of what these units actually accomplished, at the pace and under the conditions this episode has already described, suggests that bet paid off about as well as any personnel decision made by any institution in this entire war. Be precise about why this problem fell specifically to the Navy rather than to the Army's own well-established engineering corps, because the distinction matters and a loose account would blur it. Army engineer battalions did extensive and vital construction work of their own across every theater of this war, including in the Pacific, and this record does not claim otherwise. But the specific character of the Navy's island-hopping campaign, securing beachheads and immediately needing naval, air and logistics infrastructure to support the fleet's own operations, often on islands with no prior Army presence at all, created a demand for construction capability embedded directly within naval task forces, moving with the fleet rather than following a separate Army logistics chain. The Navy's answer was not a rejection of Army engineers' competence. It was a recognition that its own specific campaign, moving island to island ahead of any established supply network, needed its own dedicated builders who would land, quite literally, in the same waves and under the same naval command as the rest of the assault. State the problem these units were built to answer, because the answer only makes sense once the problem is stated plainly. A war fought across a chain of Pacific islands needed airfields, roads, docks, fuel depots and hospitals appearing again and again in places that had none of them a season earlier: jungle, coral, swamp, terrain that had never supported anything heavier than a native footpath. Ordinary military engineering units existed and did real work, but the scale and speed the specific campaign demanded outstripped what those units alone could deliver. And the Navy's own island-hopping strategy depended, at every step, on having usable infrastructure ready almost as soon as the fighting for a given island had cleared enough ground to start building on. No existing institution was quite built to solve a problem this large, this fast, this far from home. So a new one was built instead, out of the fastest available raw material. Men who already knew how to build things, given a uniform, a rifle, and an order to go do what they already did, only now under fire. There is a documented pattern of direct combat involvement worth naming beyond the general acknowledgement already given, because more than one account describes construction personnel setting down tools entirely and fighting as infantry when a position under construction came under direct ground attack, rather than merely bombardment from a distance. In several campaigns, crews building or defending an airfield or supply position found themselves for hours, or in some documented cases longer, functioning as an improvised infantry force holding a perimeter before returning to construction work once the immediate threat had been repelled. This is not the exception that proves the motto was mostly rhetorical. It is closer to the opposite, direct, repeated evidence that we build, we fight, described an actual, literal sequence of events these men lived through, sometimes within a single day, rather than a metaphor stitched onto a patch for effect. Be concrete about the basic combat training these tradesmen actually received, because issued a rifle can sound like a formality unless the training behind it is given its own weight. Recruits into these units, alongside instruction in their construction specialties, went through condensed combat training covering weapons handling, small unit tactics, and the basic soldiering skills any infantry replacement would have received, compressed to fit around the primary purpose of the unit rather than replacing it. It was not the same depth of infantry training a rifle battalion received, and this record will not pretend it was. But it was real enough that these men were not simply handed a weapon and left to figure it out under fire for the first time. And it reflected the Navy's own clear-eyed recognition, built into the units from their very founding, that construction and combat in this specific campaign were never going to stay as cleanly separated as the motto's original, half-joking tone had implied. Understand what under fire actually meant for men whose primary tools were shovels, graders, and bulldozers rather than rifles, because the phrase can slide past without its full weight unless it is made concrete. These units were not typically the first wave ashore in an island assault, but they were very often close behind it, moving onto contested ground while the fighting for the island's interior was still very much undecided, because the airfield or road they had been sent to build was needed the moment it could physically be built, not once the island was declared safe. That meant construction crews working exposed in daylight, operating loud, slow-moving heavy equipment that made poor cover and worse camouflage within range of enemy positions that had not yet been cleared, sometimes taking fire directly, sometimes simply working under the ordinary hazard of artillery and air attack that any position close to an active front endured. The rifle these men were issued alongside their trade was not a formality. It was a real acknowledgement that the job might, without warning, stop being construction and become defense, and the same man might need to set down a shovel and pick up that rifle within the same hour. Set the scene on Guadalcanal, because it is the best documented case of exactly this collision between construction and combat, and it deserves to be told with real specificity rather than left as a general claim. The airfield that would become the campaign's central strategic prize had been started by the Japanese and was seized, unfinished, by American forces in the campaign's opening days in August of 1942. Finishing it and then keeping it operational fell in significant part to construction personnel who worked the strip while Japanese naval bombardment, air raids and ground actions continued around them for months. Because the airfield's usability was not a convenience, it was the entire strategic reason the campaign was being fought at all. Men graded runway surface, filled bomb craters, and kept the strip serviceable for the aircraft that in turn kept the whole embattled position supplied and defended, doing that work through bombardments that sent them into slit trenches between shifts and back onto the runway with picks and shovels the moment the shelling paused. This channel will not inflate that record with invented specifics about a single named crew's exact hours, because the surviving accounts of a campaign this chaotic do not reliably support that level of manufactured precision. What the record does support, solidly, is the broad and remarkable shape an airfield, essential to an entire campaign's outcome, kept functional by construction crews working through active bombardment, because there was no version of the campaign's plan that survived the strip going unusable even for a few days. Hold 2, what these men were actually leaving behind at home when they enlisted, because the sacrifice looked different for a tradesman in his late 30s than it did for a teenager whose civilian life had barely begun. Many had established careers, mortgages, wives and children by the time they volunteered or were called. A domestic life fully built and functioning that a younger recruit simply did not yet have to set aside.
Choosing to leave that behind at an age when most men in most eras are settling into stability rather than shipping out to a war zone is its own kind of quiet courage. This record has not yet named directly, and it deserves to be named here, plainly, without turning it into more sentiment than the record can support. These were not men escaping into the war from lives that had nothing else to offer them. They were men who had built something worth having and left it anyway to go build something the war needed more urgently. There is a further Guadalcanal detail worth holding, because it shows how thin the line between construction and combat actually ran in specific, documented moments rather than only in general description.
During the naval and air actions that punctuated the months-long fight for the island, construction crews working the airfield were repeatedly forced to abandon equipment mid-task and take cover as air raids or naval bombardments struck the strip itself, then return, sometimes within the same hour, to fill craters the same bombardment had just created. A cycle repeated often enough across the campaign that crater filling became almost as routine a part of the daily work schedule as any ordinary grading task. That is not a dramatic single anecdote manufactured for effect. It is the documented rhythm of the work itself. Build, get bombed, repair the damage, keep building. Day after day, for months, until the campaign's outcome was finally secured. Follow these units past Guadalcanal because the pattern set there repeated with variations across most of the island campaigns that followed, and the repetition is itself part of the evidence for how essential this work actually was. Island after island, the same basic sequence played out. Assault forces secured a beachhead and pushed inland, and construction crews moved in close behind them, often astonishingly close by any peacetime construction standard, to begin building the airstrips, roads, and support facilities the next phase of the campaign would depend on. In several documented cases, construction on a new airfield began within days of a landing, sometimes while fighting continued on other parts of the same island, a pace that would have been considered reckless in any context other than a war where every day an airfield stayed unfinished was a day the wider campaign's tempo slowed.
Speed under pressure, which had been a genuine emergency improvisation at Guadalcanal, became, by the war's later Pacific campaigns, something closer to routine, an institutional capability the Navy had built, tested under fire, and then simply kept using because it worked. There is a category of construction beyond airfields worth its own mention, because this record has focused heavily on runways and the risk of narrowing the whole story to just one kind of project. These units also built and maintained port facilities, hospitals, water purification systems, fuel storage, and the ordinary infrastructure of daily life for the tens of thousands of troops moving through each captured island. Work considerably less dramatic than an airfield built under bombardment, but no less essential to the campaign functioning at all.
A hospital that did not exist a month earlier, built by these same crews, treated wounded men who would not have survived transport to a more distant facility. A working water system prevented disease that could have crippled a garrison as effectively as any enemy action. This is the least photographed, least remembered category of this entire episode's subject, and it deserves a sentence here precisely because it is the kind of unglamorous, life-sustaining work that never earns a single dramatic photograph. Only the quiet fact that man lived because of it. Widen the geography for a moment beyond the two examples this record has already named in detail, because Guadalcanal and Tinian are the best documented cases, not the only ones, and treating them as the whole story would understate how continuous this work actually was across the Pacific campaign's full length. Bougainville, the Russell Islands, the Marshalls, the Palaus, and a long list of smaller, less famous objectives all saw the same basic pattern repeated. Construction crews landing close behind or alongside assault forces, building the airfields, roads, and support facilities each specific campaign needed, at a pace dictated by the war rather than by any peacetime schedule. This record will not walk through each of those campaigns individually, because doing so would turn an hour built around a pattern into a dry list of place names with little added understanding. What matters is that the pattern held, campaign after campaign, for years. Not a single dramatic exception this channel has cherry-picked to make a point, but the actual, sustained, unglamorous shape of how this entire theater of the war was built, one island at a time. Hold one later project as a specific, concrete example of how large this work eventually scaled, because the abstraction of airfields across the Pacific deserves at least one number attached to a name. On the island of Tinian, seized in the summer of 1944, construction crews built what became briefly among the largest airfield complexes anywhere in the world. Multiple long runways carved out of the island's terrain in a matter of months, built to support the heavy bombers that would fly the war's final strategic air campaign against Japan from that base. This channel will not dwell on where those specific bombers eventually flew or what they carried. That is a different, heavier record for a different day. And this episode's subject is the builders, not the cargo their runways eventually carried. What belongs here is the plain, documented scale of the construction itself. An island transformed, in months, from captured ground into one of the largest operational air bases on Earth. By the same kind of tradesmen in uniform this whole episode has been describing, working the same long, exposed, unglamorous hours. Give the machines their due here, because the man could not have done any of this without them. And this channel has learned, across its whole run, that the tool and the person who wielded it deserve equal attention, rather than one eclipsing the other. Bulldozers, graders, and other heavy construction equipment shipped across the same contested ocean and landed under many of the same conditions as the combat vehicles this channel has spent other episodes examining, did the physical work of turning jungle and coral into usable ground, at a pace no number of men with hand tools alone could have matched. Keeping that equipment running was its own quiet battle, waged against saltwater corrosion, tropical humidity, coral dust that ground into every moving part, and supply lines for spare parts that were, like every other supply line in this theater, stretched thin and uncertain.
The man who kept a bulldozer's engine turning over on some island 1,000 miles from the nearest proper machine shop, with parts improvised or cannibalized from wrecked equipment because the right parts simply was not coming, were practicing exactly the same kind of resourceful mechanical smikalka this channel has praised in tank mechanics and truck drivers across earlier records. The trade was different. The ingenuity was identical. There is a specific kind of hazard these crews faced that combat troops mostly did not, and it deserves its own mention rather than being absorbed into the general category of dangerous work.
Heavy equipment operating at night or in poor visibility, on terrain still being cleared of mines and unexploded ordnance left by the fighting that had just passed through, carried real risk independent of any enemy action at all. A bulldozer striking a buried mine, a grader's blade catching unexploded munitions left in the ground by either side. This channel has spent this whole run insisting that the ordinary, unglamorous hazards of a war matter as much as its famous engagements. And this is one of the clearest examples this record has found. Men who could be killed not by an enemy soldier at all, but by the ordinary residue of a battle that had already moved past them, simply doing the next day's work on ground that had not yet finished being dangerous. There is a shipping arithmetic underneath this whole story too, and this channel would be inconsistent with its own recent run if it left that arithmetic out. Every bulldozer, every generator, every ton of steel, matting and cement shipped to support this construction effort competed for the same scarce merchant tonnage this record has already discussed in the context of tanks, fuel and ammunition, a competition this channel examined directly while explaining why a Japanese light tank was built deliberately small and why a tungsten shell was rationed toward machine tools instead of the front line. Construction equipment and materials were one more claimant on that same finite shipping capacity, and the fact that these projects were resourced as heavily as the record shows they were says something about how seriously naval planners weighed infrastructure against every other competing demand on the same scarce ships. Building an airfield was never merely a matter of will or manpower. It was, like nearly everything else in this ocean-spanning war, a matter of what could actually be gotten there, and someone, somewhere, decided this work was worth the tonnage it consumed. Be honest about the cost, because a record that only celebrates the achievement while skipping the price would be committing the same evasion this channel has refused in every other episode of this recent run. Men serving in these construction units, officially classified in many records as support or construction personnel rather than combat troops, were killed and wounded in real numbers across the Pacific campaigns, by air raids on the airfields and facilities they were building, by artillery and naval bombardment reaching positions that were never as far from the actual fighting as their job title implied, and in some documented cases, by direct ground combat when a position they were building near came under attack and the tools were set aside for the rifles. This channel will not offer a single confident aggregate casualty figure across the whole war for these units, because the sources this record could examine report that number inconsistently, and manufacturing false precision here would dishonor exactly the man this episode exists to honor honestly. What can be said with confidence is that the classification construction personnel on a casualty roster does not mean these men died safely, at a comfortable distance from the war. Often it meant nearly the opposite. Hold briefly the sheer diversity of trades this whole effort actually depended on, because construction battalion can flatten into a single mental image of bulldozer operators alone, and the reality was considerably wider than that. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, welders, blacksmiths, stevedores, surveyors, cooks trained to feed a battalion working impossible hours, medical personnel attached to care for the inevitable injuries of heavy construction work under combat conditions, an entire small township's worth of trades assembled, uniformed, and shipped to a jungle island together, each trade essential to the other's functioning at all. A surveyor's careful work determined where a runway could actually be laid without flooding the first heavy rain. An electrician's work kept the generators running that powered the tools everyone else depended on. A cook's unglamorous labor kept several hundred exhausted men fed well enough to keep working the following day. This channel has spent this whole episode on the more visible trades, the bulldozer operators and carpenters whose work photographs well. But the full picture includes every one of these quieter trades too, each one as essential and as thoroughly unrecorded in the popular memory of this war as any other. Give the relationship between these construction crews and the combat units they supported its own honest accounting, because it was not always a simple, uncomplicated partnership, and pretending it was would flatten a genuinely human dynamic into something too tidy. Infantry and aircrew who depended on a strip or a road being ready on schedule sometimes resented construction crews they perceived as working at a civilian tradesman's pace, rather than a wartime emergency's pace, particularly in the earliest campaigns, before these units had proven themselves under the conditions this episode has already described. That resentment, where it existed, faded considerably as the war went on, and the record of what these units could actually deliver and under what conditions became widely known across the fleet and the wider force. Reputations earned under bombardment travel fast in a war zone, and by the later Pacific campaigns, a construction battalion's arrival on an island was, by most accounts, treated less as a formality and more as a genuine relief, proof that the ground beneath the next phase of the campaign was about to exist. Say something concrete too about the actual technique behind turning raw coral and jungle into a functioning runway, because the mechanics of the work deserve the same respect this channel gives the mechanics of any weapon it examines.
Coral, once broken and crushed, compacts into a surprisingly durable surface when properly graded and rolled, and construction crews across the Pacific developed a practiced, repeatable process, clearing vegetation, breaking and grading the coral base, compacting it under repeated passes of heavy rollers, sometimes overlaying it with pierced steel planking. This channel has already examined in an earlier record for exactly this purpose, that let a raw strip of island terrain become a usable airfield in a matter of days or weeks, rather than the months a peacetime construction schedule would have required. None of this was improvised from nothing each time. It was a method, refined campaign by campaign, carried in the accumulated experience of tradesmen who had, by the war's later years, built enough of these strips to know exactly which shortcuts held up under an aircraft's weight and which ones did not.
Return to the number this hour has been carrying, because it says something about these men that no casualty figure or tonnage statistic can quite capture on its own. Many of the tradesmen recruited into these units were considerably older than the ordinary infantry replacement filling out a rifle company beside them. Men in their 30s and 40s, some with families and established careers back home, whose specific value to the war effort was not youthful vigor, but decades of accumulated skill with the trade. An 18-year-old rifleman digging in next to a 40-year-old carpenter with a rifle across his knees was not an unusual sight in some of these positions, and the gap between them was not merely a number. It was two entirely different relationships to the war. One man at the very start of his adult life, the other having set aside an already built one, both doing broadly the same dangerous work in the same exposed position, for reasons that likely differed as much as their ages did. This channel will not invent what either man was thinking. It will simply note that the gap existed, that it was real, and that it deserves to be part of how these units are remembered, rather than flattened into a single uniform image of young men in uniform. There is a particular irony worth sitting with before this record moves toward its final stretch, because it says something true about how memory actually works that this channel has circled before without stating quite this directly. The men who fought with rifles and tanks in these same campaigns are, on the whole, considerably better remembered today than the men who built the ground they fought on. Not because their contribution mattered more, this record has already argued the opposite at length, but because combat produces the kind of vivid, dramatic, individually attributable story that popular memory naturally gravitates toward, while construction produces a runway that simply exists, unattributed. The labor behind it invisible the moment the work is finished and the crew has moved to the next island. A rifleman's single act of courage can be pinned to a name, a date, a citation. A construction battalion's months of grinding, essential, dangerous work produces, at the end of it, only a strip of graded coral that nobody thinks to ask who built. This channel exists in no small part to correct exactly that asymmetry wherever it can find it. And this episode is one of its clearest attempts yet. Set this episode's whole subject against a single earlier record this channel has already made, because the comparison closes a loop that has been running underneath this entire short run, without being named directly until now. 2 episodes ago, this channel followed a small tank dismissed as a toy in one theater and vindicated in another, arguing that no machine is good or bad in the abstract, only against a specific enemy on specific ground. This episode's subject never fought a tank duel at all, and its usefulness was never in question the way that light tank's reputation was. But the underlying argument rhymes anyway. A tradesman with a shovel is judged by the loud and dramatic standards a war ordinarily rewards as a lesser figure than a rifleman or a tank crew. Judged instead by what an entire island campaign actually required to function. Airfields, roads, docks, the whole physical infrastructure. Everything else in this record depends on that same tradesman becomes one of the most essential figures in the entire theater. The measuring stick changes the verdict again, exactly as it did with the tank 2 episodes ago. Only this time, the machine being misjudged was never a machine at all. It was a man with a trade. Follow a good number of these men home, because the story does not end when the war does, and the post-war chapter is itself a quiet, undersung continuation of everything this episode has already argued. Many of the tradesmen who served in these units returned at war's end to civilian construction work in a country about to enter one of the largest building booms in its history. Highways, suburbs, dams, airports, infrastructure of every kind, expanding across the following 2 decades. Kits sharpened under the worst possible conditions this record has described, and an accumulated confidence that came from having built runways under bombardment did not simply vanish when these men traded a Navy uniform for civilian clothes. This channel will not claim a direct, traceable line from any specific post-war project back to any specific wartime veteran without a documented case to point to, and it does not have one to offer here. What it will say is that the skill and the confidence carried home by tens of thousands of men who had done this work under fire are not the kind of thing that simply disappears, and that the post-war decade's construction boom was built, in some undocumented but entirely plausible measure, by hands that had already proven themselves on Pacific coral years earlier. Consider what these units actually left behind, because it is a different kind of legacy than almost anything else this channel has examined, and it is worth naming as its own category rather than folding into the general language of wartime achievement. A tank or a rifle, once the fighting ends, becomes a museum piece or scrap. An airfield, a road, a harbor facility built by these crews very often became the foundation of post-war civilian infrastructure on the islands where it was built, used and expanded for decades by people who had no reason to know a construction battalion under fire had laid the first version of the ground beneath their feet. That is an unusual kind of legacy for a channel built around dark, cinematic, forgotten war stories to end a run on. Not a weapon's reputation, not a myth to correct, but simply ground, still in use, that would not exist in the shape it exists in without men, who mostly went unnamed, doing dangerous work that nobody photographs as dramatically as a tank duel. There is one more honest limit worth naming before this record turns toward its close. Because even an episode built to honor an underserved story owes its subject the same scrutiny this channel applies everywhere else. Not every project these units undertook went smoothly, and not every account from the period is uniformly glowing. Equipment breakdowns, material shortages, coordination failures between construction crews and the combat units they supported, and the ordinary friction of any large wartime organization all appear in the record alongside the achievements this episode has spent most of its time describing. This channel will not pretend these units were a flawless machine, simply because their story has gone comparatively untold. They were, like every other subject this channel has examined across its entire run, a real, imperfect human effort that nonetheless accomplished something genuinely remarkable under conditions that would have broken a less well-chosen or less well-led organization entirely. Widen the frame for a moment to hold this work against nearly everything else this channel has examined across its entire run. Because the comparison sharpens exactly what makes this episode different from almost all the others. A tank, a rifle, a shell, these are tools built to destroy. And this channel has spent most of its records honoring the people who use destruction well, or honestly examining the constraints that kept them from using it well enough. This episode's subject is close to the opposite. Tools and men whose entire purpose was to create, in the middle of a war built around destruction, the physical ground that everything else in this record's history depended on. That inversion is not a small thing for a channel built around dark, cinematic war stories to sit with. It is, if anything, the quietest and most hopeful thread this whole run has carried. A reminder that even inside a war this destructive, an enormous amount of the actual decisive work was building, not breaking. Ask, finally, what would have happened without this work? Because a counterfactual sharpens an argument this record has otherwise built entirely from documented fact. Every bomber this channel has ever mentioned taking off on a mission needed a runway to take off from. Every tank this channel has ever examined, once landed, needed roads to advance down and fuel depots to refuel at. Every wounded soldier from every engagement this channel has ever described needed a functioning aid station or hospital within reach of where he fell. Remove the construction crews from this record entirely, and every other episode this channel has produced becomes, at minimum, a slower and costlier version of itself, and at worst, in specific campaigns where the infrastructure genuinely decided the outcome, an entirely different and less favorable war. That is not hyperbole offered for a dramatic close. It is the plain, logical consequence of everything this hour has already documented. The quiet, load-bearing truth sitting underneath every louder story this channel has ever told. Turn briefly to where the survivors and their record now stand, because this channel's ritual of the touchable object applies here as much as it has applied to any tank or weapon in this whole run, even if the object in this case is less obviously a war relic. Preserved construction equipment from this era, unit histories maintained by veterans associations, and, in some cases, the very airfields and roads these units built, still in use in altered form, stand today as the physical record of this work. Quieter monuments than a tank in a museum courtyard, easier to walk past without recognizing what they actually are, and for exactly that reason, more vulnerable to the kind of forgetting this whole channel exists to resist. A visitor standing on a modern Pacific Island runway, unaware that its first version was scraped out of coral under bombardment 80 years ago by men wielding a bulldozer and a rifle in the same shift, is standing on a memorial that simply never got the plaque it deserved. Picture for a moment what it must have meant to be one of these men watching the campaign unfold around a strip of ground you had personally graded, rolled, and paved. To see aircraft take off from a runway that had been jungle and coral under your own hands weeks or even days earlier. To know that the pilots climbing into those cockpits owed their ability to fly this specific mission to your specific labor, even though none of them would ever know your name or think to thank you for it. That is a strange, quiet kind of pride, entirely unlike the pride a rifleman might take in a position held or a tank crew in an enemy defeated, because it never resolves into a single dramatic moment anyone else witnesses or remembers. It simply accumulates, mission after mission, runway after runway, in men who mostly went home afterward and rarely spoke of it, because to them it had simply been the job. Hard, dangerous, essential, and entirely unglamorous by the standards of what makes a good war story. Close this short run on the ordinary soldier honestly by saying plainly what these 4 episodes together have actually argued, because the argument is larger than any single machine or unit examined along the way. A tank judged obsolete in one war can still matter in another, depending entirely on the enemy and the ground. A weapon weighing 13 pounds can put a real capability into a single rifleman's hands for the first time, however imperfectly, however late the institution behind it moved to deliver it. And the ground every other story in this war's mechanized history depends on, the runways, the roads, the docks, did not simply exist. It was built, often under fire, by tradesmen the official record mostly classifies as support personnel rather than combatants, whose work is everywhere in this war's outcome and almost nowhere in its popular memory. None of these 4 stories needed a myth to correct or a legend to deflate. They needed only to be told at all. Plainly, with the same discipline this channel has spent its louder weeks defending against distortion. Because the quieter failure, the one where a true story simply never gets told, does just as much damage to memory as the loudest fabricated rumor this channel has ever taken apart. This short run closes here, 4 episodes after it began. And it is worth saying plainly what tying it off actually accomplishes for a channel whose usual subject is a machine, a myth, or a number. These 4 records did not correct a single widely repeated falsehood the way the run before them did, again and again with real force. They did something quieter, and this channel would argue no less necessary. They simply told stories that mostly go untold at all. about a tank judged by the wrong war, a weapon that put real power into an ordinary man's hands, and now the builders whose labor made every other story on this channel physically possible. A channel that only ever corrected loud errors would eventually start to look like it cared more about winning arguments than about the actual people this whole project claims to be keeping faith with. This short, quieter run was this channel's answer to that risk, and it closes appropriately with the man whose entire purpose was building the ground beneath everyone else's story. Next week, this record turns back to the machines for the season's final comparisons, closing in on the stretch this whole plan was always building toward, a tank that outlasted its more feared and more celebrated rival, not through any single dramatic engagement, but simply by continuing to run, campaign after campaign, long after the legend surrounding its rival had stopped being useful to anyone actually fighting the war. Same rule as always. We will mark the line between what the documents hold and what we have reconstructed, and we will check every number, including, this week, the quiet ones etched into runways and roads that nobody thinks to read as a record of anything at all.